Welcome to the Irish Farmers Journal broadcast from Brussels, where I'm joined by Mairead Mc Guinness, First Vice President of the European Parliament. Mairead, you're very welcome.
Yeah, and you're welcome here to the Parliament. Yeah.
Thank you. Mairead, I suppose Irish farmers, there are a number of issues that they're looking at the moment with a mixture of concern, trepidation. Certainly there's very little that I can be optimistic about. The CAP proposals have now been out for a few weeks. At this stage, the Commissioner has spoken to the Parliament. What's your first impressions of them at an initial read?
I think they're quite ambitious on two levels. One is the delivery model, which is giving more control back to the Member States. That's quite a big step. And in a sense, I think the Commissioner has been quite wise and clever, perhaps, because a lot of members of this House and indeed national Parliament say Brussels has too much control. They're telling us what to do. The Commissioner has actually said, well, now we will give you back this control. And guess what's happened? A lot of members of this House and national parliaments are saying maybe we prefer Brussels had control. So that's going to be interesting to see how people react to that.
Was that smart politics by the Commissioner?
No, I don't think it's smart politics. I think it is something that is possibly necessary. But I would say that when I talk to farmers about this and ask a show of hands, would you prefer Brussels bureaucracy or Department of Agriculture bureaucracy? They tend to plumb for Brussels. So I think there's an issue for the Department of Agriculture in that response. But it does seem logical that we have a common policy, but we have national possibilities around implementation so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all, but that we still keep the common agriculture policy. I suppose my one concern, if it is at all, is that in the last reforms in 2013, and I was centrally involved in the reform process, I was one of the negotiators, the farm organisations naturally focused on the money, which is of course a key because this money is farm income. And we tend now, and it's happening already in this debate, we're looking at, trying to cap payments, and now we're hearing that this capping proposal at 60,000 or to 100,000 won't actually be effective. And we do have to have a very clear discussion in Ireland that gets us over that idea that, because truthfully, if we took all the money off the high recipients, and maybe that is something that some people would want, and redistributed to all of the other farmers, you've had the figures in the Farmers Journal that it would make very little difference. That's because correct. There still is a big issue between farmers in Ireland. Because of the historic nature of payments, some farmers have higher payments than others per hectare. But the issue of the very large recipients, because now the payments are published, and the fact that many of them have big, are part of the processing industry, farmers are angry about that. Now, I don't know if we can translate anger into a policy proposal. And I'd love to hear from people with policy proposals, including the farm organisations, because it's one thing to talk about this publicly, and I think the Oireachtas have had big debates about capping, but I've yet to hear somebody come forward with a way of how do we deal with this that is going to pass a legal test and that is going to pass a common agriculture policy test. Of
course, at an Irish level, it won't matter that terribly much because so few farmers are receiving in excess of €60,000 in any case. 90-something% are below that.
But what's the big discussion? When you're talking to farmers, it's Absolutely. The top 10 recipients.
On the issue of budget, yes, and those are the headline grabbers from it. On the issue of the Common Agriculture Policy, surely the big issue is the budget, and the reality is there's a 5% cut this time round. Now, I know Ireland has been working to build an alliance to try and persuade member states to increase their overall contribution to fund at least the maintenance of that budget. Do you think that there's any chance of that happening?
I think at the moment the lobbying has got to intensify, and certainly we're doing it here in the Parliament. The difficulty is that there are several member states who take the view, it's very pragmatic and it's cold politics, that the European Union is smaller after Brexit, so the budget should be smaller after Brexit to reflect that. What we're dealing with is a very complicated situation where there are also proposals from some of the same member states to increase spending on security and defence and migration and border controls, while at the same time trying to do it within the limits of the current budget. And frankly, we can't do that. So I've been very tough, and many of the colleagues with me are saying, look, you cannot attack farm incomes to pay for new policy areas. It's not that I disagree that we need to spend money on migration, etc., but that I do need people to understand that you cannot rob Peter to pay Paul, and that in agriculture, to get across the message that these payments are not pocketed by farmers, but they actually go towards delivering food, and public goods. And for many farmers, particularly in the dry stock sector, the payment is their income. And I drive home that message all the time, and the incomes are low. So that therefore we have to be very, very careful about what we do. But there's been some, signals of concern from some leaders who wouldn't have the same view of agriculture as perhaps Ireland has.
This will be the second reform, I suppose, where the Parliament now is a co-decision maker in the process. Have you any inclination or any indication yet, and I do appreciate it's early stages in this, of how the Parliament is likely to accept these proposals, what changes they might look for, what stamp they might want to put on it?
I think before we even get to that place is, will we get them across the line before the elections in May of 2019? I hope we do, because I think farmers need certainty.
But will we?
But that is a very big question. If we do, it will be quite a piece of work, because remember, we have the summer recess, come back September. Brexit is also a big issue on our agenda, as are other things. It will take quite intensive work and a political will amongst the political groups. And here's the difficulty. Some members and some within political groups believe that we're better going into the election not solving the agriculture policy reforms. So in other words, that we leave it open. Others, and I think I share this view, would take, we have the opinion that we're better have solutions and certainty for farmers before the elections, because if we don't and we leave it to a new parliament, it could, if you like, disrupt the timeline. So we may see a rollover of the current cap, and then there are budgetary implications around that. So when you talk then of the details, it's hard to gauge. There's a lot of environmental requirement and delivery in this, much of which I can accept and support, as long as it doesn't add to bureaucracy. I have a real concern that what we need is sustainable farming practice rather than box ticking, and I think farmers share that. I know that when I talk to farmers, they're a bit frustrated about dates and timelines and signing in and signing out, when what they want is to farm in a way that gives them a living and that they can farm with nature. So I hope we achieve those, and that our amendments will help us achieve it.
OK, we need to move on. You mentioned there when you were outlining the year ahead that Brexit would be an issue for the autumn term of the Parliament. It's a major issue and a major concern at this stage. Are we heading for a crash on Brexit, do you believe, at this stage?
Well, I think the Commission and this Parliament, and wherever I travel across Europe, I think the signals now are suggesting that people better prepare for the worst. Not that we hope that that happens, of course, but that we would be very foolish not to prepare for what looks like at the moment a very, very, at least delayed finality to these negotiations. We've made no progress on some of the key issues. In June, we expected to do that. I'm now hearing, when I listen, that October may not even be achieved in terms of real progress. That would really worry me, that we get to December without having breakthroughs. I was in Rotterdam last Friday, and there the port is preparing. They're taking on staff. They're looking at IT solutions.
Recruiting 800 people
they're
or something like that, yeah.
Because they have got to be prepared for the worst, again hoping that it won't happen. And it was interesting in Rotterdam that the focus was on the Irish issue. For example, this invisible border that we all want to see maintained. And it was quite interesting that these business people at the meeting, whom I'm sure want to get on with business and don't want a hard Brexit, we're still prepared to work with the Irish agenda. In other words, that we do need to solve this conundrum on the island of Ireland before we see a future relationship. So I think people have got to hold their nerve at this stage. But I'm very conscious that for farmers and the industry, these are difficult times.
You've used the term there, and it's been widely used in relation to this of preparing for the worst. It's a very neat phrase, but I suppose two things. How do Irish farmers prepare for the worst? And secondly, what can the EU do for Irish farmers in the eventuality of the worst happening?
I think it is extremely difficult, and I think the onus is on the manufacturing sector. And Board B have been leading in this area. They've done a lot of work. I think the concern is that while larger companies may be able to plan and look at different market routes and market access, that for smaller companies in the food industry, they don't have the resources to do this preparatory work. But I think Board B are going to look at that. For individual farmers, let's be frank, I mean, we have lambs at home. It's very difficult for my husband to battle Brexit on his own because he's not in control of the situation. So it is quite a difficult place for farmers to be in. But when I think of the farmers in Northern Ireland who supply milk into my constituency and those with pigs who supply them to Northern Ireland, I think there we're going to have real difficulties. So look, you know, this came across in Rotterdam. Can you really prepare for something that we've never seen before, a member state leaving and the consequences that flow from that? So I suppose when I say, you know, this neat phrase of prepare for the worst, what I'm actually saying is we have to do better politically so that people do not face the worst. And I would hope that within the United Kingdom, we're hearing businesses find their voice. And I would appeal to even your good offices in the Farmers Journal, you network in Northern Ireland and in the UK, to influence those who are not into politics, but are in the business of, you know, job creation, producing food, getting it to market, to say to the politicians in the UK, get on with the job.
Okay, I suppose the one area we haven't touched on yet, and it's something that, again, it's ongoing on an ongoing basis in Brussels, the negotiation of trade agreements. The long-running Mercosur discussion remains that. It's ongoing. A deal has been sort of predicted on many occasions in recent weeks and months. It hasn't happened. But just in the last couple of weeks, the EU has opened negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. Both countries who would have huge, as they describe them, offensive interests in agriculture. That doesn't sound like good news for Irish farmers either.
Well, it wouldn't be good news if there was a sellout, clearly, but I think that the Commission have also been clear, and this House has been clear as well, that agriculture is very sensitive for us when it comes to a trade deal with New Zealand and Australia. So we're not going to do anything either hurriedly or that would damage our agriculture interests. But there's a wider trade agenda at EU level, and indeed I believe it's well linked to what's happening with Brexit. On Mercosur, the sense I get is that cows are not the problem, it's cars. So I'm being kind of tabloid about that. It is cars that are the issue. So the focus is, the pressure is off agriculture. Some people say it's 50-50. I'm not so sure. I think that the negotiations have dragged on for too long. But I suppose there's also part of me that worries that if they collapse completely, and if the UK leave and decide to do these wonderful trade agreements, that there could be a vulnerability, particularly from an Irish point of view, around that issue. So when I'm looking at trade agreements, I'm very conscious of the damage they can do to our beef and dry stock sectors, but I'm also conscious of there are other issues around the trade piece that we need to take account of. So I think it's important that Europe talks about trade, particularly at a time when the US is closing on trade and there's trade wars and all sorts of things.
And of course the European Union has many more offensive interests than has defensive interests when it comes to trade. It just so happens that it's the beef and livestock sector that always seems to be, if you like, taking one for the team.
Exactly, and I think that that's one too far. I don't think it can be expected to do that. And there are other challenges in Ireland. Talk about climate change and you know, numbers. There's big challenges, and the dry stock or beef sector is front and centre of all of these things. But I think there's an understanding here that we cannot sell out our rural areas, and that if you take away the dry stock sector from many parts of Ireland and indeed France, that what do you have left? So, you know, politically there's an understanding. We've been hammering this to the negotiators. The fact that a deal hasn't happened yet with Mercosur speaks volumes insofar as they haven't been able to get that.
And of course Parliament has to approve any deal that's agreed as well.
Yeah,
so that's,
and these things are not immediate. So that if a deal, and it looks more unlikely than likely, happens, then you are talking about a long process of, if you like, implementation. So I'm not as anxious about Mercosur, but I certainly wouldn't take my eye off the ball. And I do take your point. Look at New Zealand. We go down to New Zealand to find ways of dairy farming more efficiently. So these guys do that well. I've been down there several times. They produce lambs particularly well. It will be difficult for us to compete. We also have the issue around quotas that come into Europe currently because of the historical links with the United Kingdom. That's not solved either. So to say that
that's another part of the Brexit negotiation that doesn't really make the headlines.
It doesn't, but it's going to make the headlines if it goes wrong. And that's the thing that we have to keep our eye on. Sometimes we're talking about the stuff that is topical, but we're not talking about the stuff that actually is really, really serious and could impact on us immediately after Brexit.
Okay, Mairead Mc Guinness, I think we'll be revisiting these issues in the autumn. Thank you very much for your time.